But I'm going to hand it off to Nathan for the introduction, and I've given him a rule: you can't read what was in the meeting announcement because that's just anyway. But I think he's come up with some good ideas, and we're all counting on him. And then afterwards, I for one am very happy to go for a drink or something after. All right.
Hello. I was told I have to introduce Cristina because we went to school together, along with a few other of our colleagues. So Cristina has multiple degrees. She has a Bachelor's of Science from Colorado School of Mines. She has a Master's of Fine Arts from Middle Tennessee University, and a Master's in Acoustics from Penn State University, which is also myself. She works for Knowles as a senior electroacoustics engineer, as most of you may know. She gave a talk here last year, just about a year ago, on the Knowles curve, extension of the Harmon curve with Tom Miller, and their paper was recently published in the Journal of, or in AES, about a month ago. So. Yeah, and now we will hear from Cristina on hearing personalization, the perfect sound for you. Take it away, Cristina.
Thank you, Nate. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about hearing personalization. What does it mean? This is kind of a feature that we're seeing pop up among TWSs in the market. And so we really wanted to do an exploration of how this is kind of being done, what might make this better in the future, and how it will shape our transducers as we move forward. So, a couple things that I'm going to be covering in order to have this discussion fully. First thing I want to talk about is actually the evolution of personal hearing devices, specifically how did we get to where we are now. Target curves, why they're important as kind of a starting point for hearing personalization, and then what is hearing personalization versus what I am going to be calling customization, since there are a couple of features that are available that kind of look like hearing personalization but are not quite hearing personalization. And then so we'll look at what is actually available in the market today, and then how can we expand on these features in order to get a better hearing personalization set up for an individual. So, looking back at evolution of personal hearing devices, so if we think about anything prior to the Walkman in the late 70s, really the way that we consumed media was a kind of social experience. So you could think about FDR's fireside chats, people gathering around a radio, or if you had a portable device, it was usually something like a boombox, so it was still heard by everybody else around you. So this device was the first one where it was really just for an individual to hear whatever it is that they were listening to at the time. And of course we had headphones prior to this, but they weren't really a staple consideration. It was just something that you would need in order to be able to listen individually. Slight modification to that, 5 years later or so, the digital version of this, the Sony Discman, came out. So not a huge change, just a change in digitization of music. The really big place where this started changing, so in 2001, where pretty much the whole recording industry, as well as the technical side, was upended with the advent of the iPod. So the way that earphones kind of were packaged at this point in time was really as an accessory more than looking at it as an actual sound quality device. So it wasn't a focus, it was just something provided with the actual MP3 player. But by 2015, we saw kind of the beginnings of TWS. So noteworthy, of course, is AirPods came on the scene, and there was also a brand called Braggy Dash. Theirs was a little unique, and we're seeing some resurgence of their add-on kind of characteristics today. So they also marketed it as kind of a personal assistant, so they would have a lot of added sensors, where essentially it could monitor your heart rate, and it acted as a personal assistant for your health. And then I've added another pair of TWSs here. They're called the Hear Ones. So the prototype for these were kind of interesting. I actually bought the prototype when they were available at the time, and it really had nothing to do with streaming music content. That came in a separate version. But originally when this one came out, it was targeted at concert goers or people that would go to music festivals, and the whole purpose was being able to EQ your world, which of course sounds quite a lot like a hearing aid. And these are features that we're seeing kind of reintroduced into the market today. And so this was the beginning kind of ANC a little bit, and hearing personalization was, both of these were very much in the fledgling stages, so they were not prominent at the time. By 2017, TWS is really dominating the market, but the designs that we were seeing at the time were primarily just 6mm single dynamic drivers. By 2019, because these were dominating the market, rapidly developed, and so what we were seeing was actually hybrid designs. We're starting to see ANC implemented much more frequently, as well as this transparency feature, and became much more a premium product. So now you have to buy AirPods separately. They don't come with earbuds or the AirPods with an actual purchase of an iPhone or an iPod. And today, what we're seeing is kind of this refinement of these features and kind of an expansion of them. So of course we have some new features like spatial audio. We do have the reintroduction of sensors, so being able to monitor heart rate, blood pressure, all those types of things. We are now seeing a push for HD audio, so we are having to change algorithms and try and get lossless audio through streaming if possible. We are also seeing a push for high-res audio, or being able to have output up to 40 kilohertz, so of course that's going to shape our transducers. And now we're seeing hearing personalization. So we will focus on hearing personalization today and what that means. Before we can actually talk about hearing personalization, I'm going to do a brief talk on response curves or target curves. So when I was thinking about this, really what I was thinking about is when you create content. So if you are familiar with mixing, if you're in a studio, something that is really common is you're told pretty much don't use headphones. You have 2 monitors, maybe you have several pairs of monitors so you can check on different monitoring systems. And you want the response from your monitors to be flat. And so why do we want the response of the monitors to be flat? Well, we can consider the monitors our window to the mix. So if there's kind of a blind spot, or you can think about a notch in the response, it will be hard for you to tell what's going on in the actual mix at that particular part of the spectrum. So you want all frequencies to be able to pass through unaffected, or for this essentially to be a transparent system. But what does it actually look like to have a flat response at the sweet spot in this listening condition once that sound reaches your eardrum? So when I actually started at Knowles, this was something that confused me for a bit because I was very familiar with wanting a flat frequency response. And the receivers that we were making, and then the final product that would come out of that had lots and lots of curves, nothing similar to a flat response. And so what is important is how essentially the transfer function from considering where we're at in the room, and then the impacts of having actual ears and the ear canal, and then the impacts from the room, how that's going to change that flat response. So we might have a rise in the bass response caused by the room, potentially. And of course, we can consider that famous ear canal resonance at around 3.5 kilohertz needing to be recreated once that earphone is inserted into the ear canal. So really an ideal starting point for having hearing personalization is to have a target curve that will essentially approximate the majority of people's flat responses, right? We want an individual to hear the same thing that somebody that was mixing was creating. So if it's flat for that mixer, it's going to look quite a bit different once we're considering earphones. And then of course we have to consider, well, this isn't the same for everybody. This is going to vary from individual to individual. Even just our ear shapes are so different that this is going to change the high frequency response primarily. But then you can also throw into account how we have hearing loss. If we are older, we have natural age-related hearing loss, and we probably need to account for that. So there are a lot of factors that go into having a really good hearing personalization curve. So one thing that I went back and looked at was some research from 1995, very prominent paper that was a study on head-related transfer functions of human subjects. I believe they had 40 subjects in this. So on the left graph here, they have each individual head-related transfer function for an individual, and then the average on the right-hand side. And you can see by about 8 kilohertz that really this turns into quite a bit of a mess. So while we can find the mean value, it would be necessary to do several tweaks in order to arrive at somebody's perfect match. Now, one thing that I thought was really pretty cool, kind of looking back on it, is 1995, and something that these authors called out was, ideally this would be fulfilled for each individual listener. However, it's hardly possible to design a headphone that fits each individual listener. And so we're going to fit these for mean values only. And now, 2023, we do have the capability to technically fit it to an individual. Now, of course, finding your head-related transfer function is not exactly an easy feat. So we have to go about it in a kind of roundabout manner. But I did want to talk briefly about, this is technically conjecture. We are not quite sure that this is why the Knowles curve rates well, but it does kind of make you think about this biological basis for why our curve is rated highly. It does look fairly similar to a head-related transfer function for somebody listening at the sweet spot with the monitors where they would be. So just kind of a little bit of food for thought. So what is hearing personalization? So I'm going to make the distinction between personalization and customization. So I think most earphones available on the market have customization, so you could think about that as I have an EQ profile that I can pull up and just kind of pop onto those earphones, and now I have a different curve that I'm listening to. And so that is typically involving a customer actually making a choice, making a selection, giving some sort of an input. Whereas personalization, as far as what we see currently available in the market, involves taking some data, so doing some sort of a listening test, and then automatically creating a curve and applying it for the listener. So the listener doesn't have to do more than tell me, can they hear this tone at this level or not? So typically when you look at hearing personalization, if you find a pair of TWS that has personalization, the first thing that you'll need to do is take a hearing test. And so these are fairly similar to what you would get if you went to an audiologist. So just pure toned threshold test is typically what is available. Vast majority of them do consider the left and the right ear separately. There are a few that actually do both simultaneously, so it's not quite ideal. They present the same curve to each ear, but the vast majority of them do have a distinction for the left and the right ear. And so of course here we just have separate tones, and I believe the highest that we've seen is actually 12 kilohertz. And we'll talk about whether this is enough shortly. But essentially, we just map out the spectrum, the threshold, essentially, for an individual, and then apply that curve automatically. Now, there's another type of test that I think only 2 pairs of TWSs are currently using. Maybe you're familiar with this type of test, perhaps not. This is called otoacoustic emissions testing, and this is actually what is used to test the hearing of a newborn. So it doesn't require any sort of feedback of, can you hear this, can you not? So that works off of the fact that you can kind of consider the ossicles in our ears to have an amplifying factor. Amplifiers naturally have a distortion, and so otoacoustic emissions actually detect that response or that distortion coming back. So our ear or our hair cells actually respond when given a sort of tone. So that's kind of a novel one that is currently available in the market as of July or August of this year. And what we think might be more appropriate is accommodation all the way up through 16 kilohertz. So something that we kind of did at the end of our study with the Knowles curve is we brought maybe half of our participants back in to do a second listening test, and we presented them with their now ideal curve, whatever they wanted to be listening to. And then we essentially created different filters, different low-pass filters, and then told them, can you rank these from narrowest to greatest bandwidth? And what we started to see, and this was done at 80 dB SPL, is that for somebody with little to no hearing damage, so that would be this green curve on this graph here, essentially people could hear up to about 16 kilohertz, and then beyond that, it was really hard to tell the difference. So for listening at kind of a moderate level, it would make sense for all of this hearing personalization to be available up through 16 kilohertz at least. Now, of course, you can also consider changing the level, but because we are in the high frequencies, that threshold is so steep that you would have to bump it up quite a bit in order to hear beyond that to hit 17 or 18 kilohertz. So that's somewhat unlikely, but perhaps a consideration for later. And of course, so I said this is in contrast with customization. So the way that I've seen some of these apps kind of apply the two, so if it has both, there's the possibility for the app to show you your hearing personalization curve. Sometimes they don't show you it at all. And sometimes you are able to see that curve and then manipulate it after the fact. So kind of apply your own EQ on top of your hearing personalization. Other times they keep them totally separate. They say, okay, here's your hearing personalization. Do you want to add another EQ on top of it? Totally apart from that. So kind of like stacking two EQs on top of one another, rather than just modifying the first. But again, what's really important here is a listener is really taking this EQ, whether it is just choosing a profile and saying, oh, I want the bass boost profile, or I want the bright profile, or actually having an EQ in front of them where they are manipulating things. It is a conscious effort that they have to put in order to have customization. So what is actually available in the market? So here are a few of the ones that we were looking at while looking into hearing personalization. So of course, of note, always AirPods Pro at the front. Want to draw attention to Jabra, since they have several models that have hearing personalization. I would think that that is tied to the fact that they are a subsidiary of GN, essentially. They're partnered, and so it would make sense for a hearing aid company to be able to help their TWSs have hearing personalization, since they're kind of approximating the same thing in a certain sense. And then I also wanted to draw attention to Denon, which actually was NeuroBuds. So NeuroBuds went away and partnered with Denon. If you're not familiar with Denon, they are really famous for having the kind of home receiver stereo system. But they are actually the ones that use otoacoustic emissions for their listening tests. So their Pearl Pros are actually short for personalized listening. And those are the ones that hit the market in August of this year. And these other ones are noteworthy as well. But typically what happens is they'll have some sort of a personalization partner. So in blue below, I have all of the companies that are kind of providing this DSP to the TWS companies and who they typically partner with. So you'll see Skull Candy on there twice, so they chose different partners for different TWSs. But the most prominent of these, and so you'll see it on the left-hand side, is Mimi. So we're going to talk about them first. But one quick note, because I have importable on here. So this is referring to the audiogram. So whether a hearing test is required or whether you can just import it is essentially what this is labeling. So let's talk about Mimi. So this is definitely the most renowned of all of them. And as of this point, they have two different types of tests. So you can do the kind of standard pure tone threshold test, what you would get at the doctor's office. They also now have a masked threshold test. So you could think about kind of the limitations of doing a pure tone threshold test. You need a controlled environment, somewhat unlikely to find, and somewhat difficult to find these thresholds with the given time frame of any of these tests. So one consideration for any of these hearing personalization partners is really the fact that a consumer doesn't want to spend more than 1 or 2 minutes on a listening test. So there's a trade-off for that time in terms of resolution and accuracy. So they came up with a new method, which is this masked threshold test, which is essentially just tones in noise. So some information about the signal to noise ratio of how, if you're able to hear a tone in noise, tells them about your thresholds. And I'm not familiar with exactly how that works, but that is their new proprietary test. One thing with Mimi, so their max gain available is 12 decibels, which if you mix 12 decibels sounds great. That's a pretty hefty boost, but we're going to see that that may need to be significantly greater in a moment. They claim to have 10 EQ bands, so 1 per octave, which is reasonable. So about, 1 per octave should be enough. We don't want too many fine features typically. They do have signal-dependent equalization, so they treat the high frequencies differently. They compress them 2 to 1, which makes sense when we consider Fletcher-Munson curves and how our thresholds shift. And so they do have an upper frequency limit, and theirs is not just kind of a plateau after that. There is a hard drop-off at 12 kilohertz. So not necessarily ideal when we consider the study that we just showed where 16 kilohertz is probably the lowest that we should be going. But when we think about all of these things kind of put together, conservative design avoids the risk of overcompensation. So there's no risk of being offensive, right? If the hearing test was not perfectly accurate, there's very little risk of somebody coming back and saying, oh wow, this sounds terrible, because it is such a gentle kind of processing. And then this does not compensate for variations in volume control settings, which would be ideal when we consider Fletcher-Munson curves, which I will show in a bit if you are not familiar with those. And so these, again, what we're going to end up seeing for all of these hearing personalization partners is really they're only trying to treat mild hearing loss. It's really not to optimize the response of the earphone. So whatever the response of the earphone is intended to be, they're just trying to get you back to that. New feature, as of a few months ago, I believe, they came out with a Transparency Plus feature. And so this is essentially, they have 2 controls, so you can control the ambient level and the conversation in front of you, and you can essentially mix the 2. What is really cool about this, if you'll look at this diagram here, is you'll notice that this processing actually happens within the earphone, and it is really important that we start making our earphones smarter. And we'll talk about Bluetooth bottleneck in a couple of slides, but this is really kind of a great step forward. As far as listening tests, so they did do a couple of them, and currently they claim to actually be rated higher than anybody else in the market. So we see Apple AirPods right here, and then we have Mimi Transparency up above that relative to clean speech. So they say currently their algorithm is the one that is most highly rated for transparency. Another player that we see in the market is Audiodo. They do not have anything other than the pure tone threshold test. They do have a little bit more of a boost, so they have 15 decibels available. They also have 10 EQ bands. They do also have some slightly different treatment of high frequencies where they'll boost them by 0.7 times rather than just 1 to 1. Again, trying to kind of do something to compensate for the fact that if you boost it too much, it might feel too bright. And low-level listening is treated differently than loud listening, but it is not a perfect approximation of how our hearing changes. The upper frequency limit for this is 8 kilohertz, but this flattens out, so there is no steep drop-off. So this one might be a little bit more effective. It depends if you're considering the actual hearing threshold where that is rising steeply. This may not be sufficient, but it does continue up through 20 kilohertz. And once again, conservative design, avoid the risk of overcompensation. So they will not be offensive in the slightest. And this is currently not supported in any other modes. So This is simply for streaming music, where the ideal case would be, okay, now we know what your hearing is like, so we can apply this to transparency and effectively start approximating some sort of hearing aid capabilities. And two more that I want to talk about briefly. So there is Jacoti and Massimo AAT. So Jacoti is interesting. They have what they call a pure tone or a duotone test. And so they have added a silent stimulus, which they say removes the guess factor, or essentially when you have somebody come in and do an audiogram, there is risk of them saying that they can hear something when they cannot. So telling them that there are silent stimuluses makes them more likely to just say, nope, I can't hear it. And so it kind of gets you to the answer a little bit more quickly, or to the correct threshold. This is also supported in transparency mode, so a good step in the right direction. 15 dB, so matching audio. Claims dynamic EQ, a couple more bands of equalization, and again, target audience, mild to moderate hearing loss individuals. And then the last one on here is Massimo AAT. So they are currently big player in the market for sensors. They're doing a lot with medical devices in terms of being able to track heart rate, things like that, but they are also the ones that are doing the OAE measurements and have partnered with Denon or Neurophone for the Pearls or the Pearl Pros. Now the elephant in the room, of course, Apple. What are they doing? So they currently do not have their own hearing test. There is some kind of rumors floating around that they will Sherlock that capability and fold it into their next OS update, as the rumors always go, and we'll see what comes of that. But they do allow you to import any sort of audiogram that you have, so you could go to an audiologist and figure out what that looks like, and then import that into the software and have your curve based off of that. You could use Mimi, or you could use a few other partners. So really quite versatile there. And then max gain at 23 dB. So considerably more than the other players on the market currently. Okay, so they do have what we're calling hearing personalization. They have it listed as headphone accommodations. And so they have a variable EQ to compensate for hearing loss, which is what we are seeing in the market. And the really good thing about what Apple is doing, so you can actually apply these to not only streaming content, but you can apply it to your transparency mode. So again, actually making it more like a hearing aid, and you can apply it to any sort of phone call that you are receiving. And of course, we mentioned you can use an audiogram, or you can use some other device that imports your audiogram, or you can actually choose from a list of presets. Then this can be applied to any of these different modes. Now, Apple does also have this conversation boost, so this is what Mimi was comparing with their Transparency Plus. So they have a directional mic pattern, which essentially allows for the conversation boost, but within Apple, you cannot control the ambient level versus the conversation level. So that is really the difference between the Transparency Plus from Mimi and the conversation boost from Apple. But they do have noise reduction and gain and EQ adjustments. So pretty capable transparency processing. One other thing that was pretty noteworthy as far as what Apple is doing is they have personalized volume. Changes are probably slower than is ideal, but it responds to environmental noise, and supposedly Apple claims this uses machine learning to choose the settings, but this is ignoring content level. So it's really listening to your surroundings and then saying, is this environment too loud, and then kind of ducks everything down. So how is this impacting the marketplace, all of the things that we're seeing as far as hearing personalization? So one kind of noteworthy thing, and it is fairly slow, like I believe first of these happened maybe 15 to 20 years ago, and it's been very slow since. But what we're seeing is essentially hearing aid manufacturers are buying up pro and consumer audio companies. So you think Sonova, Sennheiser, GN, Jabra. We saw those three Jabra earphones that have hearing personalization. And of course, we're also seeing kind of this odd blend of a TWS with a hearing aid show up in the marketplace. So now we have Sennheiser/Sonova's recent release of the Conversation Clear Plus. We have the Jabra Enhance Plus, over-the-counter hearing aids, and then Nuheara IQ buds. So all of these significantly heftier price point than, say, AirPods, which are usually around $200. But when you consider relative to a hearing aid, $800 versus $5,000 seems like a much more reasonable choice. So this is going to impact the market considerably. It can be kind of an entryway for having a hearing aid where it can destigmatize the use of hearing aids and just enable people to kind of consider their own hearing loss limitations and introduce them to this kind of hearing. Now, personally, I think that Apple is actually doing a really great job destigmatizing by not claiming anything that they're doing in terms of actually having these hearing assistive features. So when you think about it, an individual with hearing aids doesn't want to be seen as an individual with hearing aids. They want to just be like everybody else. And Apple AirPods at this point are somewhat of a fashion statement. They're kind of an indicator of social status. And so to be able to use AirPods as hearing aids, although makeshift hearing aids, is kind of a great way to start this destigmatization process. And not only does destigmatization of hearing aids, but this coupled with the recent kind of requests for sound quality improvement and the higher demand for HD audio are going to boost the need for hybrid designs. So we're still seeing some designs on the marketplace that have single dynamic driver, and as we're seeing more of these features pop up, there is a need for a hybrid design. So, how can what is currently available in the market be changed in order to have better hearing personalization? So one thing that we had found during the course of our Knowles curve studies was relative to the currently available target curve, the more prominent one at the time, people wanted up to 21 dB of boost at 16 kilohertz. So when you think about all of the partners that we just talked about, Mimi, Audioto, Jacody, all of those could not provide 21 dB of boost. The only one that could do that was Apple. They hit 23. But even then, we're not catering to everybody in the older age group. So this group, right, this is an average. There were some people that wanted 27 dB of boost. So it would be really, really important to kind of boost the upper or the max gain that we can provide with these TWSs. Another consideration is the Bluetooth bottleneck. So trying to apply this boost it's really important to consider where it happens kind of in our signal chain. If we try to apply it in the app and then it goes through the Bluetooth connection, there can be significant degradation or distortion and kind of artifacts that get imparted by the Bluetooth. So it's really, really important that our earphones start getting smarter so that we can create that boost at the actual earphone, because typically our transducers can hit that boost. It's just a matter of being limited by the Bluetooth connection. So that will be necessary, and we're seeing some of that start up. And we would also want to consider Fletcher-Munson curves, right? So we think about the audible range, commonly cited 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, but that's not really a complete picture, right? Because we just talked about that study that we did at 80 dB and the fact that people really couldn't tell a difference up to or past about 16 kilohertz. So, of course, this is dependent on level. So, we don't hear all frequencies to be the same loudness when presented at the same SPL. There is kind of a spectral envelope, and this shifts with level. And we should be considering this, right? So what level am I listening at, and how do I treat that relative to what I see in front of me? And of course, we would ideally have a frequency-dependent compression. Again, focusing on the high frequencies just because they're the easiest and kind of most neglected range at this point. So if I'm listening very, very quietly, we know that it'll be hard to hear bass, it'll be hard to hear treble. So ideally, when we're listening very quietly, we would have a really large boost at the high frequency. So that would be this blue curve here. But as I bring up my level, that would be entirely too shrill. So we would need to be able to bring it down. So that would be another ideal addition to hearing personalization. So we said, expand the bandwidth, so at least up to 16 kilohertz for hearing personalization. Expand the gain capabilities so that we can hit 21, 27 dB even of boost. Make them available in all modes. I want to be able to have that on transparency. I want to use it as a makeshift hearing aid. And then make it adaptive and dynamic as well. And all of this will eventually, hopefully, lead to destigmatization of hearing aids and age-related hearing loss. So with that, when we look back, really all of this has stemmed from the innovation of being able to listen on our own, right? The fact that I prior was listening with a lot of people, there's no need to personalize anything. But now that we're listening individually, it only makes sense that we would want things to suit us perfectly. And in order to attain best sound quality ratings, so there have been a lot of studies on sound quality ratings, what we are seeing is essentially this is primarily tied to the frequency response. So barring anything odd like distortion, artifacts, things like that, of course those will have an impact. But if everything sounds pretty good, really sound quality ratings is tied to the frequency response. And so in order to get a good frequency response, that's going to vary from individual to individual. So the ideal would be start with kind of that mean target curve that approximates most people's best response and then fine tune it for each individual. And so of course we said, along with that, we're going to need greater bandwidth, greater amount of boost available, and then adaptive and dynamic EQs. And what we're kind of seeing the beginning stages of is this fusion of TWS with hearing aids, and ideally destigmatization of hearing aids. I would expect hybrid sales to be boosted as we have all of these features that need these capabilities, and we now have demands for higher sound quality. So hearing personalization will be a key player for the best sound quality ratings. With that, I want to thank Tom for all of your data and help putting this together, and thank you guys for coming out, and I will open it up for questions. Yes.
So I remember back in 2015, the Bragi Dash and the Here One, and everyone was very excited. I forget which one of them, but one of them, the kind of main feature they advertised and never delivered was you'd be able to put apps on your hearable, like third-party software. And you mentioned wanting to have more processing on the earbud rather than the phone. And I'm curious if we'll see more of a shift to putting software right on these devices, or if it'll kind of stay on the phone with maybe improved wireless protocols.
So I think that depends. Primarily the limitations with the Bluetooth connection involve level. So I think anything that involves EQing significant levels or anything like that, yes, we will see that need to shift into the actual hearing device. Anything else, and I'm trying to think what would be a good example of some other type of processing. But effectively, if it doesn't involve kind of hitting the ceiling, the DBFS ceiling, I think that it would probably be okay to stay within the app. I'm curious if Tom has.
There's no common operating system for headphones, so it's very hard to add third-party stuff to the headphone.
Yeah.
There's no hooks to grab into.
So they have,
It's very chip specific.
but they have startups that are trying to make a common OS. Spittle was working for one.
Yes.
Is there any way to measure the autoacoustic emission signal from the headphone, or what would be I guess, a common way of measuring that.
You're talking about the otoacoustic emissions test that they do?
Yeah.
So I mean, they do use the headphone to kind of check the response from the ear. So they'll have the speaker or the driver play whatever signal, and then they'll detect it right with the microphone that's in the actual earphone. Yeah. Yes.
What about long-term hearing damage if you're boosting a lot, like if people listen for like 8 hours a day?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends how much of the spectrum you're boosting, because like as an example, when we were doing all of the Knowles curve studies and we had 21 dB of boost relative to where we were at 16 kilohertz, I think globally when we summed everything up, it was maybe the addition of 2 to 3 decibels. So like when you think about everything, so it's not like we're boosting the entire range 20 dB, because then yeah, that would definitely be concerning, but we're just talking about a small portion of the spectrum.
And she also talked about it being dynamic. So you don't make the loud stuff louder. You only make the soft stuff louder.
Yeah.
So sort of on that same note, my general understanding, and correct me here, but if you're wearing one of the $5,000 hearing aids, that sort of thing is like, the trade-off there is that you are potentially damaging the hearing, and that's understood, and that's the trade-off because you need that help. If that's the case, as these get better and better, at what point I mean, it's basically the same guy's question, but just, are we heading in that direction where we actually are going to be potentially damaging hearing?
I would not think so. As these things get smarter, I think it may have been somewhat of a risk, but there is so much processing with hearing aids. It's like right now we're trying to get TWSs in that space to kind of do what hearing aids are doing. I think it would be dangerous if they are kind of trying to approximate it and don't have all of the processing to actually pull back when the signal is really loud. But as long as they're dynamic. So right now, nothing is offensive enough, right? Nothing is 15 dB to really cause any problems. And I would assume that we wouldn't try to hit that without having smart processing.
Is that a bad assumption on my part that a good hearing aid causes damage?
I have not heard any evidence of
That is
that.
not the case.
I think everything's pretty well compressed, so they
Yeah.
stay below. Because they protect you from the loudest sounds. They make the loudest things
Yeah.
in the room softer. And you were testing the Sennheiser headphones, wouldn't let you listen to music loud. They would pull back. If there was a lot of high frequency content in the music, it would back it off
Yeah.
on the Sennheisers.
105.
So that could be a trend too.
Well, also like the spectral belt composition, most of what you're listening to, you're really not getting that much in the top octave
Yeah.
anyway. So, yeah, let's say you apply that 18 dB of boost, there's so little of it to actually excite it that you're probably okay.
Yeah.
The one question I've had as a hearing aid user, I'm very used to listening over headphones, and I take my hearing aids out because they don't work with headphones. And so I'm very accustomed to the way music sounds without hearing aids. And I'm wondering if users who use this feature might dislike it just because it's different from what they grew up with or what they're used to.
You're in charge of the preferences.
Oh, let me see. Because I have that one. Hold on. Yeah. So that was actually a big question when we started the Knowles Curve project is, are people going to not like a boost because they're used to what they're hearing now? Or are they going to want it to sound like what they remember it sounding like when they were young? And as far as what we see, they want restoration of their hearing back to when they were young. Yes.
I might have missed a step in your study. I think
Sure.
the question that you posed to your subjects was decide what has the most bandwidth, and how do you translate that to quality?
That was it. Yeah, it's a different test.
Yeah, that was actually kind of, I feel like, added I gotta figure out where it is. That was an added portion that I don't even believe we added to the publication itself. It was kind of out of curiosity by the end of the project.
This was after they'd already chosen their preference.
Yeah.
Preferred amount of boost. Then we tested to see, can you really tell? But if we start fudging the bandwidth. So this was a separate test than the graphs she just showed you, where people picked the amount of boost they liked. Then we had this add-on test just to see, well, would you notice if we threw away some of that?
We've got a couple of questions from the chat.
Sure.
First one is, wasn't there a Bose entry in this market?
Probably. I did not study that one. So I can't speak to that.
They have the earphones.
So Bose has the earphones, but those aren't
Earphones.
meant to be a general music. Those are just basically a hearing aid. So that they haven't combined their music product and their hearing assist products yet.
Okay.
I'm
I'm not sure if that was audible online. So they have not yet combined the TWS feature with the hearing aid. So that one was more of a hearing aid device.
So the other question is, what are the effects on subjects with tinnitus?
A fantastic question that is outside the scope of this research. I can't speak to that at all. No.
If I had to guess at the tinnitus question, I think there's some studies that show that tinnitus patients like masking,
Yeah, I've seen
That-
that as well.
that they like masking, which would imply that if you have this low level boost, more stuff would get masked. You know, that that would be the first hypothesis I guess, but you know, it's not coming from a high point of knowledge.
Yes.
Which earphones would you buy?
Of all of the ones that I had listed, so I actually am pretty fond of the Liberty Pro 3s. They stick out a little bit more than I'd like. They fall out of my ears a little bit more than I'd like, but I really like how these sound. I think I would like AirPods, but I've actually never tried them. And I haven't listened to the vast majority of these, so this would be my pick right now. Yes, Keegan.
So you talked about destigmatization
Yeah.
of hearing aids.
Yes.
Is there any thought to there being a stigma of using TWS in listening situations, like, you know, if I'm talking to somebody and they have headphones in, am I going to be like annoyed that they're wearing headphones, like they're not
I feel
listening
like-
to me?
I feel like that is somewhat of a generational stigma. I feel like as the younger generation comes up, they're all used to kind of talking like that. So I don't foresee it being a problem I don't know. I think it depends on the generation.
Go away eventually. Yeah.
I mean,
Oh, depends on whether they're paying attention to you or not.
I mean, that's the thing, like when I was growing up, right? If you're wearing headphones in class,
Yeah.
right? Like your teacher just assumes you're not paying
Yeah,
attention,
exactly.
right? And you get in trouble, right? You get your iPhone or your iPod taken away, right? But that's going to be normal now.
Potentially.
In fact, it's helping people
Yeah.
instead of being a distraction.
One more question? Anything? Well, thank you so much. This was wonderful, wonderful. A wonderful presentation and the debut of our
Wow.
new mug. The new AES Chicago mug that has the reverse, so it's as if there's a hole through it. So you can enjoy that all day. But anyway, here's our traditional, here you go. You can.
Thank you.
There you go. Thank you so much.
much.
Wonderful, wonderful. We'll have you back every year.
Can do.